In the same house, the most incestuous patriarch of Alabama impregnated mother, daughter, and sister. Through the corridors of the Shelby County Courthouse in 1968, these words echoed when the Harmon family case came to light, revealing one of modern American history's most disturbing stories of consanguinity. South of Birmingham, Alabama, in the dense hills far from the urban bustle of the 1960s, there existed an almost inaccessible property. For at least 4 generations, a faded wooden house built at the century's beginning had sheltered the Harmon family. The isolation was not just geographic, it was cultural and genetic, too. To an anonymous report about children in precarious conditions, social worker Thomas Wheeler and Deputy Sheriff Robert Collins responded on the cold morning of November 23, 1968. For almost an hour, they navigated narrow paths before reaching the clearing where the main house stood. At first glance, the property seemed abandoned, a 2-story structure with its white paint almost completely peeled off, revealing the rotten wood underneath. Across the yard, rusty tools, car parts, and debris had accumulated. Among the debris, skinny chickens pecked, and a skeletal dog was chained to a post. When they knocked, the door was opened by Elmer Harmon, a man of approximately 50 years with a much older appearance. With hunched shoulders and a suspicious look, this tall, thin man reluctantly allowed them to enter. Even worse conditions were revealed inside. The air was permeated by the smell of mold and urine. In the main room, a fragile-looking woman, no more than 35, cradled a newborn baby. As his wife, Mary, Elmer introduced her. Then Wheeler noticed another woman, appearing to be about 70 years old, sitting in a rocking chair. As his mother, Martha Harmon, Elmer introduced her. Most disturbing, however, was that Martha also cradled a baby, apparently just a few months old. "And who is this baby?" Wheeler asked. "He's my son," Martha replied without any trace of shame. As they talked, a young girl of about 16 came down the stairs carrying another infant. The teenager had facial features suggesting genetic abnormalities, widely spaced eyes, a receded chin, and low-set ears. "This is my daughter, Ruth," said Elmer with a tone mixing pride and possessiveness. "And this is her baby." Something deeply disturbing was dawning on Wheeler. 3 generations of women, all with babies. When Collins asked directly who the father of these children was, Elmer's response shocked them both. "They're mine," he answered defiantly. "They're all my children. This is my family, and no one has anything to do with it." To maintaining consanguineous relations with his own mother, wife, and daughter, Elmer Harmon had just admitted, and to being the father of all 3 recently born babies. "Here, the laws of God and men don't apply," Elmer continued. "We are a special family. For generations, we've kept our blood pure." Within hours, the Harmon property would be surrounded by authorities, and an investigation would begin to reveal the horrors hiding behind those time-worn walls. Just beginning to unfold was the story of Elmer Harmon, the man who impregnated his mother, wife, and daughter, a genetic and social nightmare spanning nearly a century of isolation and forbidden practices. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You won't want to miss any details of this real story exposing the devastating consequences of isolation and consanguinity in American families. To access the next chapters of this impactful investigation that will change your view on the hidden history of the American South, subscribe now. With Elmer, the story of the Harmon family didn't begin. Back to the American Civil War, the roots of that consanguineous lineage dated when, after deserting from the Confederate Army in 1863, Jeremiah Harmon, Elmer's great-grandfather, settled in that remote region of Alabama. A violent and paranoid man, Jeremiah chose that isolated location to avoid authorities. With him came his young wife, his sister, and 2 cousins, the original nucleus that would give rise to one of the most genetically closed lineages in modern American history. In 1968, when authorities began investigating Elmer's case, they discovered diaries written by various Harmon family members across generations. A disturbing ideology that developed in isolation was revealed in these documents. From the diary of Frederick Harmon, Elmer's father, written in 1932, an excerpt said, "We keep our blood clean while the world out there corrupts itself. Stronger than the previous one is each Harmon generation. Weak children don't survive. Only the strong remain." It's nature's law. With Jeremiah, this distorted thinking originated and was passed down as a sacred tradition. For more than a century, the extreme isolation allowed these practices to continue without external interference. One of the rare external additions to the Harmon lineage was Mary, Elmer's wife. Born in an impoverished rural community about 30 miles away, she met Elmer during an agricultural fair in 1952. At only 16 years old, Mary saw in Elmer, then 34, an opportunity to escape her own family's misery. A reality very different from what was promised was discovered by Mary upon arriving at the Harmon property. The house was in ruins, the land barely produced enough food. And she quickly realized that something deeply disturbing existed in the relationships between Elmer and the other family members, especially his mother. When Martha first became pregnant by Elmer, Mary tried to escape. Before reaching the main road, she was captured and kept chained in the barn for weeks. Of more than 15 years of psychological and physical captivity, this escape attempt marked the beginning. An extreme example of how geographic isolation can lead to genetic isolation is what the Harmon case represents, explained Dr. Richard Thompson, a geneticist who studied the family. When for generations a population remains isolated and consistently practices consanguinity, we see a gradual collapse of genetic diversity, leading to a concentration of harmful recessive mutations. In Elmer's generation, this concentration of recessive genes began to show its devastating effects. Of the 8 children his mother Martha had, only 3 survived to adulthood, the others died from various congenital complications. Evident signs of genetic collapse were shown by Ruth, Elmer, and Mary's teenage daughter. In addition to distinctive facial features, she had severe scoliosis, fused fingers on both hands, and significant cognitive delays. During the investigation, at the back of the property, authorities found an improvised cemetery. The graves of dozens of Harmon children who didn't survive were marked by small wooden crosses, many already rotted by time. Some graves had only numbers engraved in the wood, without names or dates. To justify their practices, the family maintained an elaborate belief system. They didn't see consanguinity as wrong or harmful, but as a way to preserve what they called the Harmon essence, an almost mystical concept of family purity that transcended common laws. The investigation further revealed that Elmer wasn't the first in his lineage to maintain relations with multiple generations simultaneously. His own grandfather, Isaiah Harmon, had followed a similar pattern, having children with his mother, sister, and 2 daughters. On December 12, 1968, 3 weeks after the initial discovery, a coordinated operation between social services, law enforcement, and medical teams took place. The objective was to remove all vulnerable family members and transport them to facilities where they could receive adequate care. Contrary to the authorities' fears, there was no armed resistance. Sitting on the porch, Elmer was found, seemingly resigned. "You've come to destroy something you can't understand," were his first words to Sheriff Tanner. Ends today, 100 years of Harmon history. Inside the house, the medical teams found a situation even more disturbing than initially reported. Besides Martha, Mary, and Ruth with their respective babies, 2 more teenage sons of Elmer and Mary were discovered hidden in the attic, 14-year-old twins who showed evident signs of malnutrition and serious developmental problems. A museum of horrors of human genetics, it was like entering one, reported Dr. Elizabeth Carter, a pediatrician on the medical team. Visible marks of generations of consanguinity were carried by every person in that house. A slow and delicate process was the removal of the family members. Despite her age, Martha proved surprisingly lucid, a social worker noted. "You think you're saving us," she said, "but you're just separating what God has joined together." Special are the Harmons. We always have been. Evident relief was shown by Mary when she understood she would be taken far from that property. In a moment of privacy with a social worker, she whispered, "Please, don't let him find us again. He'll kill us all if that happens." Unable to fully understand what was happening, Ruth, the teenage daughter, seemed. Clinging to her baby, she rocked her body back and forth, repeating, "Daddy comes back. Daddy always comes back. Special, we are. We're Harmon." In the days that followed, through detailed medical examinations, the magnitude of the Harmon case began to reveal itself. The The twins, Jacob and Joseph, presented a clinical picture that shocked even the most experienced doctors. Both had a rare condition called phocomelia, characterized by abnormal development of the limbs, which were extremely short and deformed. Severe intellectual disability and congenital heart problems were also shared by them. At 16 years old, Ruth showed signs of premature aging with severe arthritis in her hands and spine. From the union with her own father, her baby was diagnosed with multiple genetic conditions, including Apert syndrome, characterized by premature fusion of the skull bones and severe facial anomalies. Multiple cardiac malformations were presented by Martha's baby, which doctors predicted would be fatal within months. In February 1969, the child would die, confirming the somber medical prognosis. During psychological evaluations, a disturbing pattern of mental conditioning emerged. With a worldview where consanguinity was not just acceptable but desirable, a sacred duty to preserve the Harmon essence, the women and children had been indoctrinated. The only voice of resistance within that closed system was Mary. During her sessions with psychologists, she revealed how she had tried to protect her children from Elmer. "I knew it was wrong. I always knew," Mary confessed. "3 times I tried to escape with the children. They always found us. The last time, as punishment, he broke my leg." As the investigation progressed, a complex challenge was faced by prosecutors: how to present a case that defied common understanding, how to explain the evolution of a family lineage that had developed a belief system normalizing universally condemned practices. Eventually, fragments of the story were captured by the local press. Cautious and vague were the first reports, but as details began to leak, the story gained national attention. To protect the victim's privacy, the authorities obtained a court order restricting coverage of the case. Meanwhile, in the county jail, Elmer Harmon showed himself to be surprisingly calm and cooperative. About his practices and beliefs, he spoke openly during interrogations without showing any sign of remorse or understanding that he had done something wrong. "You don't understand because you're not Harmon," he frequently repeated to investigators. "A greater purpose, our lineage has. Each generation brings us closer to perfection. The weak branches being pruned are just the children who don't survive." When you realize the gravity of this case, it's impossible not to feel a mix of horror and compassion for the victims. If this account touched your heart, leave in the comments, "May justice be done for the victims of the Harmons." To keep alive the memory of these people who suffered in silence for so many generations, your voice matters. In the Shelby County Courthouse, the trial of Elmer Harmon began on March 17, 1969. Despite restrictions on press coverage, so much interest had been generated by the case that local citizens began forming lines before dawn to secure a place in the audience. That they were about to hear testimonies challenging their understanding of the depths of human depravity was warned by Judge Harold Montgomery to the jury, and he asked them to maintain objectivity despite the certain shock. With a powerful statement, the prosecution, led by Jonathan Reynolds, opened the trial. Not just the trial of a man, this is of an entire system. It is the trial into a perverse genetic experiment, a system that transformed a family where children were born condemned to lives of suffering, where women were reduced to mere vessels to perpetuate a sick lineage. In the hands of Theodore Barnes, a court-appointed lawyer, was Elmer's defense. The only strategy he considered viable was adopted by Barnes, arguing that Elmer, a product of generations of isolation and consanguinity, did not possess the mental capacity to understand the criminal nature of his actions. This line of defense was vigorously rebutted by prosecutor Reynolds. From reality to the point of not understanding the nature of his acts, Elmer Harmon was not isolated. When it suited him, he interacted with the outside world. Because deep down he knew they were condemnable, he consciously chose to hide certain practices. On the 4th day came the most impactful moment with Mary Harmon's testimony, transmitted by closed-circuit television. 16, I was, when I met Elmer, she began. A better life, he promised me. Land, he said he had, a big house, that we would never want for anything. Her arrival at the Harmon property and the gradual understanding of the nightmare she had entered were described by Mary. She talked about her first escape attempt when she discovered Martha was pregnant by Elmer. By my hair, he dragged me back. In the barn in the cold, I spent 3 weeks chained. When Mary described how Elmer justified his actions came the most devastating moment. Our purpose, he said it was, that special blood the Harmons had that needed to be kept pure. When with problems children were born and died, he said it was because true Harmons they weren't, that it was nature eliminating the weak. That Mary had also been conditioned to accept these practices over time was tried to be suggested by the defense attorney during cross-examination. One of the most remembered quotes from the case would become her response, of those 16 years, every day I thought about running away. While he slept, every day I thought about killing Elmer. To rescue us, every day I dreamed of someone coming. Because I had children to protect, I survived. If in your eyes that makes me an accomplice, may God have mercy on your soul, because what it's like to live in hell you don't understand. Context about how isolated communities can develop radically divergent belief systems and the biological consequences of prolonged consanguinity was provided by experts in psychology, anthropology, and genetics. On the trial's 10th day, against his lawyer's advice, Elmer Harmon took the witness stand. The guardian of the Harmon lineage, I am, were his first words to the jury. Sacred duty, we call what you call crime. The future, my great-grandfather Jeremiah saw. Impure, he saw the world would become, that lineages would mix until nothing of value remained. Of true blood, the last bearers are the Harmons. That he maintained regular contact with the outside world when necessary and that he deliberately concealed certain practices because he knew they would be condemned was led to admit by Reynolds during cross-examination. So, concluded Reynolds, wrong society considered your actions, you knew, but above these laws you decided you were. Delusion, this isn't, Mr. Harmon. Criminal arrogance, this is. After 6 hours of deliberation, with a verdict the jury returned, guilty on all charges. 2 weeks later, the sentence was pronounced by Judge Montgomery, multiple consecutive penalties totaling 197 years in prison. Upon hearing the sentence, Elmer remained impassive. At Prosecutor Reynolds were directed his last words recorded in court, ended the Harmon lineage today, you think you are, but like seeds in the wind we are. Fertile soil, some always find. One day, you will understand. In 1969, the trial and conviction of Elmer Harmon did not end the family's story. Only a new chapter marked by scientific discoveries and consequences extending for generations did it open. After the trial, to different institutions Elmer's direct victims were sent. In 1972, in a long-term care facility, Martha died. After extensive counseling, under a new identity, Mary managed to partially rebuild her life. In a specialized institution, the twins, Jacob and Joseph, were placed. Aimed at young people with special needs, Ruth was sent to a rehabilitation program. By carefully selected families, the surviving babies were adopted. In 1975, approval for a longitudinal study of the surviving Harmon family members was obtained by Dr. Richard Thompson. The systematic documentation of the genetic consequences of 4 generations of consanguineous marriages was begun by the Harmon Project. Transformed our understanding of how extreme inbreeding affects the human genome is what we learned, explained Thompson years later. Multiple rare recessive genes appearing with alarming frequency in the Harmon lineage were identified in the preliminary findings. Particularly significant was the discovery of a rare metabolic condition later termed Thompson-Harmon syndrome, characterized by an enzymatic deficiency affecting the metabolism of certain amino acids. In almost 40% of the studied Harmon descendants, this condition was present. More than originally thought, the studies also revealed the Harmon lineage had branched out. During the period between 1880 and 1920, to establish their own branches in other isolated areas, several young men from the family had left the main property. At least 3 small isolated communities in rural areas of Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee where direct descendants of Jeremiah Harmon established themselves we identified, revealed anthropologist Dr. James Peterson. As extreme as Elmer's branch, consanguinity these communities did not practice, but still they maintained significant genetic isolation. In 1988, a woman of approximately 30 years with facial features typical of the Harmon lineage was identified by researchers. His biological daughter, conceived before his arrest, was confirmed by genetic tests to be Elmer's. A temporary worker on the Harmon property who fled and later gave the child up for adoption was her biological mother. This woman, identified only as subject age 47, in a normal environment with adequate nutrition and access to education and medical care, had grown up. Surprisingly, although she still presented certain distinctive genetic characteristics, fewer health problems than other direct descendants of Elmer were demonstrated by her. How environment can partially mitigate even severe genetic predispositions, AG 47's case shows us, concluded Thompson. Of the complex interaction between nature and nurture, it's a powerful reminder. In 1992, with new genetic sequencing techniques, a specific group of mutations researchers identified they called the Harmon signature, a unique combination of genetic variants producing a characteristic set of physical and neurological conditions. At least 14 specific mutations that in combination produced the phenotype repeatedly observed in Elmer's direct descendants were identified by them. In 1994, at age 76, Elmer Harmon died in prison. Living under a new identity, Mary agreed to give a single interview. The horror, the shock, the disturbing details, people remember, she said. The lives that continued afterward are what they don't see, the children who survived, the grandchildren who were born, how some of us managed to find some peace despite everything. A way to give meaning to her family's suffering was considered the scientific work by Mary. From this terrible story, if something good can come, it's the knowledge that will help other people. Using our DNA, each discovery they make is a small victory against the evil Elmer represented. In the early 2000s, with the advancement of the Human Genome Project, a new phase was entered by the Harmon Project. The multiple mutations present in the lineage were mapped with unprecedented precision by researchers, creating the most complete map of extreme human inbreeding ever documented. One fascinating aspect was the identification of resilience genes, rare genetic variants that seem to confer certain protection against consanguinity's most devastating effects. Several of these protective variants were presented by Martha Harmon, partially explaining how to 74 years she lived despite being a product of multiple generations of consanguineous marriages. Today, more than half a century after the initial discovery, in both science and culture the legacy of the case continues to reverberate. Scattered are the descendants of the family, many living without knowledge of their origin, others actively involved in efforts to break the cycle of isolation and destructive practices. In a specialized institution, some stability was eventually found by Ruth. Although completely independently she never managed to live, remarkable artistic skills were developed by her. In various galleries, her paintings, intense, emotional, and often disturbing, were exhibited. In 2011, at age 59, peacefully she died. To 30 years old, the twins lived, far beyond initial medical expectations. With loving adoptive parents, Mary's baby grew up and managed to lead a largely normal life. Of his origin, this person today has knowledge and occasionally in voluntary genetic studies participates. For decades, the original family property remained abandoned. In 1997, the main house was destroyed by a fire, leaving only stone foundations and chimneys as silent reminders. In 2005, into an environmental preservation area with no mention of its dark history, the land was transformed. For genetic science, a watershed was represented by the Harmon case. For society, a powerful reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation and the importance of effective protection systems for the most vulnerable, the story remains. Before retiring, as Dr. Thompson reflected, how human beings can create alternative realities justifying the most destructive practices, that is what the story of the Harmons is about. But about resilience it is also about how some people, even from the most horrible circumstances imaginable emerging, can still find some measure of peace and meaning. If this far you've watched, it's because this story you like. Leave a comment saying, I watched this far so I can get to know you and find out who really enjoys the stories on this channel. So you don't miss our next investigations into real cases that history tried to hide, don't forget to subscribe. So we can reach more people interested in these impactful historical accounts, leave your like, and share with friends who appreciate documentaries about real cases challenging our understanding of human nature.